At 5:30 in the morning, the silence of Silver Creek was shattered by a rock scraping against my window. My daughter-in-law was screaming my name outside like she owned the place. Through the glass, I saw my only son raising a jagged stone, his eyes bloodshot. He thought the old woman inside was cowering in fear. He had no idea that for 4 months, I had been building a trap that was about to snap shut. My name is Eleanor Grace Whitford, and at 62 years old, I was standing in the center of my darkened living room while my own flesh and blood tried to besiege me. It was 5:30 in the morning in Silver Creek, Colorado, a time when the world should have been wrapped in the heavy, silent blanket of winter. Instead, the pre-dawn quiet was violently torn apart by the sound of impact. A jagged noise vibrated through the walls, the sound of minerals scraping against wood, and the terrifying rattle of a double-pane window being tested to its limit. Then came the voice, shrill and piercing enough to wake half the neighborhood. "Eleanor, open this door. Open it right now." It was Sabrina, my daughter-in-law. She screamed my name not with respect, or even common decency, but with the entitlement of a landlord demanding rent from a squatter. She yelled that this was their house too, her voice cracking with a mix of hysteria and fury. I stood there with my bare feet pressing into the chilled hardwood floor. The cold seeped up through my soles, but I barely felt it. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that might have been mistaken for terror by an outside observer. But I was not afraid. Not anymore. The trembling in my hands had nothing to do with fear. It was the physical manifestation of a rage I had been suppressing, fermenting, and nurturing for exactly 4 months. I moved silently toward the large bay window that overlooked the front yard, careful not to cast a shadow. I eased the edge of the heavy velvet curtain back just an inch. The scene outside was illuminated by the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp at the end of the driveway. There was Ethan, my only son. The boy I had nursed through fevers and cheered for at little league games was standing on my frost-covered lawn, gripping a rock the size of a grapefruit. His face was twisted, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, looking like a stranger wearing my son's skin. Beside him stood Sabrina. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her chin tilted up. She was not screaming at that moment, but the smirk on her lips was louder than any shout. It was a smile of anticipated victory. She thought she had already won. "I am going to smash this damn window." "Eleanor," Sabrina shrieked, her breath puffing out in white clouds against the dark air. "You have no right to change the locks. You cannot kick family out into the cold." I let the curtain fall back into place. For 30 years, I worked as a dedicated social worker for the North Lake Community Services Bureau. I spent decades sitting in sterile offices, listening to the elderly weep as they described how their children had drained their bank accounts or bullied them out of their homes. I had held their hands. I had promised them justice. I never once thought that after retirement, I would become the case file. I never imagined I would be the one standing on the other side of the door, listening to the people I loved try to break in. Outside, I heard the gravel crunch. Ethan was shifting his weight. He was winding up for another throw. This time, he would not aim for the wood. He was aiming for the glass, just as I braced myself for the crash. A deep, calm voice spoke from the shadows directly behind me. "Wait. Let me handle this." I did not jump. I knew he was there. I reached out and flipped the switch for the porch light and the interior chandelier simultaneously. In one fluid motion, I yanked the curtains wide open and stepped aside. I was not alone. Standing like a sentinel beside me was Marcus Hale. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored dark navy suit that seemed absurdly formal for this hour of the morning. In one hand, he held a thick leather briefcase. In the other, he held a sheaf of documents stamped with the seal of the district court. The effect was instantaneous. Through the glass, I watched the blood drain from Sabrina's face. She went from flushed with anger to a sickly, sheet-white pallor in a heartbeat. Ethan froze mid-motion, his arms still cocked back, his eyes locked onto Marcus, and then down to the legal documents in his hand. Recognition dawned on him, followed immediately by horror. The heavy rock slipped from Ethan's fingers. It hit the frozen ground with a dull thud that seemed to echo the sinking of their hearts. They stood there, paralyzed on my front lawn, looking at the mother they thought was senile and weak. They had come here to break me. Instead, they were staring at the architect of their undoing. But to understand why my son was holding a rock, and why a lawyer was standing in my living room before dawn, I have to take you back to the beginning. I have to tell you how I let the enemy in through the front door, and how I learned to stop being a mother and start being a survivor. 4 months ago, my life was defined by a quiet that was both peaceful and suffocating. I had just retired early after 30 years of service with the North Lake Community Services Bureau, leaving behind a career spent wading through the wreckage of other people's families. My husband had passed away 6 years prior, leaving me alone in our large, 2-story Victorian home in Silver Creek. It was a house built for noise and children, but for years, it had held only the sound of my footsteps and the creaking of the floorboards. I spent my days tending to the rose garden my husband had loved so dearly, trying to convince myself that the solitude was a reward, not a sentence. My relationship with my son, Ethan, was the one crack in my foundation that I could never quite seal. He was my only child, and he carried a resentment that had hardened over time like concrete. He often accused me of choosing my cases over him, of saving strangers while leaving him to raise himself. It was not entirely true, but guilt does not require truth to be heavy. I carried that guilt every day, always waiting for a chance to prove to him that he was my priority. That chance came in the form of a frantic phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, while snow swirled outside my kitchen window. Ethan was on the line, his voice trembling with a panic I had not heard since he was a boy. He told me that their rental apartment in the city had been condemned due to toxic mold. He said they had to leave immediately, that the landlord was kicking them out, and that they were drowning in debt with nowhere to turn. Before I could even process the crisis, Sabrina took the phone. Her voice was smooth, lacking the raw panic Ethan displayed, but laced with a performative concern that made my stomach turn slightly. She told me they did not want to be a burden. She said they would figure something out because she just could not bear the thought of imposing on me. Then, she delivered the line that she knew would shatter my defenses. She whispered that she simply worried about me dying all alone in that big, cold house, without anyone to find me. The image of my own lonely death, paired with my son's desperation, broke me. I insisted they come home. I told them the guest rooms were empty and waiting. I convinced myself this was not a burden, but a blessing. It was an opportunity to heal the wounds between Ethan and me, to finally be the mother he claimed I never was. They arrived the following Saturday. I stood on the porch, wrapped in my wool cardigan, watching the moving truck back into the driveway. I had expected a few boxes of clothes and perhaps a mattress, given their story of financial ruin. Instead, I watched in confusion as movers hauled in oversized boxes of brand new electronics, designer furniture, and wardrobes of expensive clothing. It was a jarring sight. For two people claiming to be destitute, their possessions screamed of excess. Sabrina stepped out of her car and surveyed my home with critical eyes. She walked through the front door, not with gratitude, but with an air of appraisal. She ran a finger along the wainscoting and wrinkled her nose. She commented that the house felt heavy and old, and that the smell of the pine wood was overwhelming. She suggested the walls were too dark and depressing. Yet, the moment Ethan walked in behind her with a box, her face transformed. She smiled brightly, hugged me tight, and called me Mom in a voice dripping with sugar. Ethan looked exhausted but relieved. He hugged me and promised it was temporary. He swore it would be 3 months maximum, just until they found a new place and got back on their feet. I looked at them, my son and his wife, filling up the hallway that had been empty for so long. I pushed down my doubts about the expensive furniture and Sabrina's backhanded compliments. I wanted to believe that my family was whole again. I stood by the window that evening, watching their 2 cars parked next to the garage. The house felt full. I felt needed. I told myself that the heaviness in my gut was just the adjustment to a new routine. I had no idea that as I locked the front door that night, I had just sealed myself inside a war zone with the enemy. The first few weeks were deceptively peaceful, like the calm surface of a lake hiding a dangerous undertow. I found myself cooking large dinners again, something I had not done since my husband passed. We sat around the dining table, passing bowls of mashed potatoes and roast chicken. Ethan talked excitedly about modernizing the house, suggesting new paint colors or opening up the kitchen. Sabrina played the part of the doting daughter-in-law perfectly. She brewed fresh coffee in the mornings and teased me about my old-fashioned teacups. I let my guard down. I wanted so badly for this to work. The erosion began with a single chair. I came home from grocery shopping one afternoon to find my husband's favorite leather armchair missing from the living room. It was worn and cracked, the leather shaped perfectly to his frame. And it was where I still imagined him sitting on lonely nights. When I asked where it was, Sabrina barely looked up from her phone. She told me she had moved it to the garage because it was simply too ugly to be in the main room. She said it ruined the aesthetic. I looked at the wall above the fireplace and realized my wedding portrait was gone too. In its place hung a generic abstract print Sabrina had brought with her. The next day, I noticed the bookshelf in the den looked barren. My husband had spent a lifetime collecting first editions and history books. Half of them were gone. When I confronted Sabrina, she waved a hand dismissively and said she had donated them to charity. She claimed no one read them anyway, and they were just gathering dust. She spoke as if she had done me a favor. The real blow came on a Thursday. I returned from a doctor's appointment to find a team of strangers in jumpsuits moving through my house. Sabrina had hired a deep cleaning crew without asking me. They were hauling boxes out to a skip in the driveway. I ran out, my heart pounding, and saw the wreckage of my husband's model train set sticking out of a black trash bag. He had spent 10 years building that set. It was delicate, intricate work. Now it was crushed under a pile of old newspapers. I cried that night. I stood in the kitchen and wept, holding a broken piece of a miniature train station. But when I tried to explain my pain to Ethan, He did not hug me. He sighed. He told me I was clinging to the past. He said I was turning the house into a museum and that Sabrina was just trying to make the space livable for everyone. He looked at me with pity, as if my grief were a form of madness. I started to wonder if perhaps he was right. Maybe I was just a lonely old woman holding on to junk. That doubt was the soil in which Sabrina planted her control. She changed the Wi-Fi password and forgot to give me the new one for 3 days. She started moving my personal knickknacks into the corners of the room or hiding them in drawers. She instituted quiet hours because she claimed she worked from home. Though I never saw her do much more than scroll through social media, I suddenly needed to give notice before inviting anyone over. My world began to shrink. Sabrina started complaining to Ethan that my friends were too loud or too negative. She told me I should stop spending so much time with the neighbours, specifically Marjorie, because they were just gossiping old biddies who put bad ideas in my head. Slowly, the visits stopped. I stopped inviting people over because I was too ashamed of the tension in my own home. One evening, I stood in the hallway in my nightgown, looking into my own living room through the crack in the door. It was unrecognizable. The warm oak furniture was covered with stark, white throws. The smell of my husband's pipe tobacco and old books was replaced by the chemical scent of Sabrina's reed diffusers. It looked like a showroom, cold and impersonal. Ethan and Sabrina were sitting on the sofa, laughing at something on the television. Sabrina stretched her arms out and sighed contentedly. She said it was so nice to finally relax in our house. She did not say your house. She said our house. And Ethan said nothing. He did not correct her. He just smiled and held her hand. I stood in the dark hallway, gripping the doorframe. And for the first time, the thought crystallized in my mind. I was no longer the owner of this home. I had become a guest who had overstayed her welcome, sleeping in a bedroom that they were already measuring for something else. The conversation about money began with a smile, the kind of disarming expression a predator wears before the strike. Ethan sat me down at the kitchen table one evening, pouring me a cup of tea with unusual attentiveness. He started talking about an investment opportunity, a small boutique coffee shop that Sabrina had always dreamed of opening. He painted a vivid picture where I was the centerpiece. He told me it would be a family business, a place where I could come every day to socialize, drink coffee, and never feel lonely again. He made it sound like he was doing it for me. Sabrina slid a binder across the table. It contained a business plan with colorful charts and spreadsheets. As a former social worker who had helped countless families manage their finances, I spotted the holes immediately. The projected profits were optimistic to the point of delusion, and the operating costs were woefully undercalculated. However, I looked at my son's hopeful face, and the professional skepticism in my brain was overruled by the desperate mother in my heart. I wanted to believe in them. Then came the ask. They did not want a small loan. Ethan suggested I leverage the one thing I had sworn never to touch: his father's vintage 1972 pickup truck. It was pristine, kept under a tarp in the garage, the last tangible piece of my husband's passion. Ethan proposed selling it to fund the startup costs, promising to pay me back with interest within 12 months. When I refused, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The warmth evaporated. Ethan did not yell. Instead, he aimed for a much softer, more vulnerable target. He brought up his childhood. He talked about the soccer games I had missed because of work, the dinners he ate alone while I was handling crisis calls. He looked me in the eye and asked if I was going to choose a dead man's truck over his future, just like I had chosen strangers over him when he was a boy. The guilt was a physical blow. It broke my resolve. 2 days later, I signed the title over, feeling like I was betraying my husband with every stroke of the pen. The truck was sold for $45,000. I waited for news about the lease signing for the coffee shop. It never came. Instead, I started finding receipts in the trash that had nothing to do with espresso machines. I found an invoice for a luxury day spa package costing $600. I saw new, high-end furniture being delivered to the guest room they occupied. Then, a brand new white SUV appeared in the driveway, registered in Sabrina's name. When I confronted them, trembling with the shock of the deception, Sabrina did not apologize. She burst into tears. She screamed that she was exhausted, that she had put her entire career on hold to take care of me, and that she deserved a little compensation for the emotional labor of living in this depressing house. She twisted the narrative until I was the villain. Ethan shook his head at me, looking disappointed. He told me I was being paranoid and overly sensitive about money, acting as if the $45,000 was a trivial amount. The unease in my gut drove me to the bank the following Tuesday. I asked for a balance inquiry on my primary savings account. The teller, a young woman who had known me for years, looked uncomfortable as she slid the paper across the glass. The balance was significantly lower than it should have been. Nearly $15,000 had been withdrawn in a series of transfers. I asked how this was possible without my presence. The teller revealed that Ethan had been added as a joint owner on the account 3 weeks prior. She showed me the digital scan of the authorization form. There was a signature at the bottom. It spelled my name, but the loop of the L was wrong, and the slant was too aggressive. It was a forgery, but it was close enough to pass a casual glance. That night, while the house was silent, I crept into the study and opened the floor safe hidden under the rug. My hands shook as I sorted through the files. The life insurance policies were not in their usual order. The deed to the house had been moved. It felt as though someone had been rifling through my life, calculating exactly what I was worth dead versus alive. I sat on the floor in the dark, realizing that the safety I thought I had built over a lifetime had been dismantled, lock by the people sleeping down the hall. It was 2 a.m. when the insomnia finally drove me out of bed. The house was silent, or so I thought, as I crept down the stairs in the dark to get a glass of water. The wooden steps were cold under my bare feet. I reached the bottom landing and was about to turn toward the kitchen when I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a low, urgent whispering coming from the living room, a space where Ethan and Sabrina were supposed to be asleep on the pull-out sofa. I did not turn on the light. Instead, I pressed my back against the wall, breathing shallowly, and listened. Sabrina was speaking, her voice sharp and devoid of the sugary sweetness she usually plastered on for my benefit. She was talking about legal guardianship. My blood ran cold as I heard her listing incidents that had never happened. She told Ethan that they needed to document every time I forgot my keys or left a light on. She said they needed to build a case for dementia. She was twisting my mundane moments of forgetfulness into a diagnosis of incompetence. Then the conversation took a darker turn. Sabrina suggested that words might not be enough. She lowered her voice, but the house was so quiet I heard every syllable. She proposed that perhaps I needed to have a small accident, a fall down the stairs. Nothing fatal. Just enough to warrant a trip to the emergency room and a doctor's note regarding my frailty. She called it creating a paper trail. I waited for Ethan to scream at her. I waited for my son to defend me. Instead, I heard a long, heavy silence, followed by his hesitant voice asking if that was really necessary. Sabrina cut him off instantly. She told him that once the court declared me incapacitated, everything would be under his control. She said he would be the one to sign for the house, the accounts, and the assets. She framed it as an act of mercy, claiming it was the only way to secure their future. Then came the sentence that severed the last thread of my heart. Ethan sighed, a sound of resignation, and said that maybe she was right. He said that I had lived enough. He said I did not need a house this big for just one person anyway. I felt like a knife had been dragged across my chest. I retreated to the kitchen, not daring to make a sound, my thirst forgotten. I hid behind the refrigerator cabinet, trembling not from cold, but from a terror I had never known. I was sleeping under the same roof as people who were actively plotting my demise. The next morning, the nightmare continued in the harsh light of day. I was in the hallway when I heard Sabrina on the phone in the guest room. The door was ajar. She was speaking to someone in a professional, predatory tone. She referred to me not as her mother-in-law, but as the Whitford case. She told the person on the other end that it was a good deal and that the timeline was accelerating. It sounded like she was closing a business transaction. I realized with a sickening jolt that I was likely not the first elderly person she had targeted. This was a rehearsed routine. I drove to my family doctor later that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I asked him directly if anyone had been inquiring about my health. He looked uncomfortable, but admitted that Sabrina had visited him twice in the last month. She had expressed grave concerns about my memory and cognitive decline, asking him to note her observations in my file. I sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour after that appointment. My 30 years as a social worker came rushing back. I had seen this pattern a dozen times in my career. The isolation, the financial draining, the gaslighting, the medical fabrication. It was the classic playbook of elder abuse. I had spent my life protecting others from this exact scenario. And now, I was the victim in the case file. I drove home and went straight to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I looked in the mirror. I saw the grey hair, the deep lines around my mouth, the tired eyes of a 62-year-old widow. I looked frail. I looked like exactly what they thought I was. But then, I leaned closer to the glass. I forced myself to look past the wrinkles and see the woman who had fought for hundreds of vulnerable people in court. I saw the steel that used to be there. I straightened my spine. I wiped the tears from my cheeks. I decided right then and there that they would not get to write the ending of my story. I was not going to be another file in a cabinet. I was going to be their worst nightmare. I knew I could not fight this war alone. My mind immediately went to Marcus Hale. Years ago, we had worked side by side on some of the bleakest cases at the Bureau. He was a man who had seen the worst of human nature and had never blinked. Now, he ran a private practice in Denver, specializing in elder law and financial abuse litigation. I called him from a payphone outside the grocery store, terrified that Sabrina might check my cell phone logs. We met at a nondescript diner off the highway, miles away from Silver Creek, where no one would recognize us. I sat in the booth with my hands trembling as I slid a manila envelope across the chipped laminate table. Inside were copies of the bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, the forged signature card, and the bill of sale for the pickup truck. I told him everything. I told him about the conversation I had overheard in the kitchen and the plan to declare me incompetent. Marcus studied the papers in silence. When he looked up, his expression was hard. He confirmed exactly what I feared. This was a textbook case of elder financial abuse. He explained that we needed irrefutable proof before we made a move. We needed to catch them in the act of conspiracy. And we needed to lock down my assets before they could drain the rest of my accounts. He proposed a strategy that felt drastic, but necessary. He suggested we place the house and my remaining liquid assets into an irrevocable living trust. This would effectively remove the property from my direct name, making it impossible for Ethan or Sabrina to sell it or borrow against it, even if they managed to get guardianship. We needed a trustee and a beneficiary who was not Ethan. I chose my niece, Lucy, who lived in Oregon. She was kind, successful, and had never asked me for a dime. Signing those papers was one of the hardest things I have ever done. As the pen hovered over the signature line, I felt a wave of nausea. It felt like I was disinheriting my own child. It felt like a betrayal of the boy I had raised. But then I remembered his voice in the dark, agreeing that I had lived long enough. I remembered the cold calculation in Sabrina's tone. I signed my name. I was not betraying my son. I was surviving him. Before we left, Marcus handed me a small, digital voice recorder. It was no bigger than a pack of gum. He told me to hide it in the common areas where they felt most comfortable talking. Then he gave me the most difficult instruction of all. He told me to go home and continue playing the victim. I had to be the confused, forgetful, frail old woman they wanted me to be. I had to let them believe their plan was working so they would get sloppy and arrogant. I drove back to Silver Creek and made one more stop. I went to the house next door to see Marjorie. She was a widow like me, a sharp-witted woman who spent her days on her porch observing the neighborhood. I trusted her. I told her the truth. Marjorie did not look surprised. She told me she had seen the way Sabrina looked at the house, like a wolf eyeing a sheep pen. She promised to be my eyes and ears on the outside, ready to testify if it came to that. From that afternoon on, I lived a double life. To Ethan and Sabrina. I was Eleanor the burden. I shuffled when I walked. I pretended to forget where I put my glasses. I asked the same questions 3 times in a row, just to watch Sabrina roll her eyes at Ethan. I played my part perfectly. But the moment they left the room, I was Eleanor the investigator. I retrieved the recorder from the vase of dried flowers or from under the sofa cushions. I photographed receipts they left on the counter. I kept a detailed log of every terrifying comment and every missing dollar. That night, for the first time in 4 months, I took the spare front door key out of the magnetized box under the porch railing. I did not put it back. I slipped it into a hidden pocket inside my winter coat, deep in my closet. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. I was no longer the confused old lady losing her keys. I was the keeper of the gate, and I was preparing to lock them out for good. I began to treat my confusion like a garment I could put on and take off at will. In the mornings, when Sabrina was in the kitchen, I would deliberately leave the milk on the counter or ask her what day of the week it was. I watched her eyes light up every time I stumbled over a word. It was the validation she craved. She needed me to be broken so she could feel justified in sweeping up the pieces. Sabrina became bolder with her cruelty. She stopped whispering. She would sit across from me at the dinner table and talk about the amenities of the Maple Ridge Care Facility as if she were reading a travel brochure. She told me I would be so much happier there because they had a television in every room and nurses who could help me bathe. She said I should be grateful that they were willing to handle the burden of this big, empty house once it was transferred to Ethan's name. She spoke of my displacement as a foregone conclusion. I played the part of the listener, but in secret, I was the observer. I hid the small digital recorder Marcus had given me inside a dried flower arrangement in the foyer. I tucked it under the cushions of the sofa while they were out. I placed it behind the books on the shelf in the den. Every evening, I retrieved it and listened to their private conversations. I recorded Sabrina discussing exactly how they would split the proceeds from selling my home. I heard her explaining to Ethan how to hide the money in separate accounts so the tax implications would be minimal. One evening, I decided to set a trap. I sat in the living room wringing my hands and asked them what would happen if I became too shaky to sign important papers. I asked if that would stop everything. Sabrina laughed, a harsh sound, and told me not to worry. She boasted that she could sign for me if necessary. She admitted, loud and clear, for the recorder spinning silently in the vase nearby, that she had signed checks for her grandmother for years after the woman had lost her sight. It was an admission of prior fraud, and now I had it on tape. 2 days later, Ethan came home with a thick stack of documents. He told me they were standard medical forms, just a medical power of attorney so he could make decisions if I fell ill. He tried to sound casual, but sweat was beading on his upper lip. I took the papers with a trembling hand, even without my reading glasses. I could see the legal headers. It was not just for medical decisions. It was a broad, durable power of attorney that would give him total control over my assets immediately upon signing. I feigned a headache. I told him my eyes were too tired to read the fine print, and that I would look at them in the morning. He tried to press a pen into my hand, but I dropped it, playing up my frailty. He eventually relented. The next morning, the moment they left the house, I drove straight to Marcus's office. He made copies and notarized a statement that I had been presented these documents under false pretenses. We now had proof of their attempt to strip me of my rights. The tension in the house spiked as the week wore on. Ethan and Sabrina were becoming agitated. They had likely checked the joint account again and realized the balance was significantly lower than they expected, as the majority of my liquid assets had already been quietly moved into the trust. They were running out of patience. I was in the kitchen early one morning, making coffee, when I heard them arguing in the garage. The door was thin. Sabrina was hissing at him. She said that if I did not open the door to the legal process willingly, they would have to use force. She suggested that perhaps a break-in would scare me enough to sign. She said if I loved locking the doors so much, maybe they should smash a window. She argued it would give them a reason to call the police and claim I was unsafe living alone. I stood by the toaster, listening to them plot a violent crime against my home. I realized then that the game of cat and mouse was over. They were ready to use claws. I sat down at the breakfast table a few minutes later as they walked in. I lifted a spoon of oatmeal to my mouth, letting my hand shake visibly, spilling a little milk on the placemat. Ethan looked away in disgust, but Sabrina watched me with cold calculation. Inside, however, my mind was steady. The pieces were all in place. I knew exactly what they were going to do, and I knew exactly how I was going to end it. It was time to stop hiding. It was time to let them throw the first stone. The phone call from Marcus came in the middle of the afternoon, short and definitive. He told me the irrevocable trust had been officially recorded at the county courthouse. The legal firewall was up. My house, the physical manifestation of my life's work, was no longer an asset that Ethan or Sabrina could touch, sell, or borrow against, regardless of what guardianship papers they managed to trick a judge into signing. The trap was laid. All we needed now was for them to walk into it. I decided to accelerate the timeline that very evening, during dinner, while pushing peas around my plate with a trembling hand. I looked up at Sabrina and told her that perhaps she was right. I said that maybe it was time for me to move into the Maple Ridge facility and that I should probably rewrite my will to make things easier for them to manage. The change in the atmosphere was electric. Sabrina's eyes widened with a predatory gleam, and she immediately stopped eating. Ethan leaned in, eager to close the deal, and offered to set up an appointment with their lawyer the next day. I played the role of the submissive mother perfectly. I nodded and told Sabrina she could just draft the papers herself so I could sign them and get it over with. I thanked them for their patience. Then, keeping my voice wavering and small, I asked a question designed to plant a seed. I asked if the house was safe enough for them to stay in alone, specifically worrying about the old glass in the windows. Sabrina smiled, a cold expression that did not reach her eyes, and remarked that glass was fragile and could break very easily if one was not careful. It was a subtle threat, a reminder of the conversation I had overheard about staging a break-in. Later that night, I locked myself in the bathroom and called Marcus. I told him they were agitated and ready to move. Marcus wasted no time. He contacted the Silver Creek deputy sheriff, a man I had helped years ago during a custody dispute involving his sister. He was a good man who trusted my judgment implicitly. Together, they woke up a judge to sign an emergency protective order based on the evidence of financial exploitation and the threat of physical harm we had already compiled. The walls of my house were thin, and the silence of the night carried every sound. I lay in bed and listened to the argument erupting in the guest room. Sabrina was pushing Ethan to the edge. She hissed that he needed to be a man for once in his life. She told him that he had to claim what belonged to him, or she was walking out. She gave him an ultimatum to resolve the situation immediately. Finally, I heard Ethan roar in frustration and agree to end it that night. I did not sleep. I moved through the house in the dark, guided only by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. I quietly cleared the coffee table of the ceramic vases my husband had brought back from Italy. I locked the cabinet containing the fine china. I was clearing the stage for a brawl. I left only the hallway nightlight on, casting long, eerie shadows across the floorboards. At exactly 4 a.m, I heard a soft knock at the back door. I opened it to find Marcus standing there in his dark suit, looking grim but ready. Beside him was the deputy sheriff, fully uniformed, holding a video camera and a thick folder of documents. They entered silently, like ghosts. We set up in the living room, positioning ourselves in the shadows where we could see the front window but could not be easily seen from the outside. The waiting was the hardest part. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, each one sounding like a hammer strike in the quiet house. I stood by the heavy velvet drapes of the front bay window, my hand resting on the fabric. At 5:25, the silence was broken. I heard the hum of an engine coming down the street. A car door slammed shut. Then came the crunch of heavy boots on the frozen gravel of the driveway. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the final confrontation. I watched the shadow of my son stretch across the lawn. I gripped the curtain, took a deep breath, and prepared to reveal the truth. The sound of the rock hitting the glass was sickening, a sharp crack that seemed to split the very air of the room. A spiderweb fracture bloomed instantly in the center of the bay window, distorting the angry faces on the other side. Sabrina was screaming now, her voice raw and piercing. She yelled for me to open the door before they called the police, accusing me of being a danger to myself, claiming I was locking them out because I was having an episode. It was a performance designed for the neighbors, a desperate attempt to control the narrative before the glass even fell. I did not flinch. I reached out and yanked the heavy velvet drapes all the way back, flooding the front yard with the harsh light of the living room chandelier. The effect was immediate and satisfying. Ethan stood there with his arms still raised, his face contorted in a mask of rage and adrenaline. But as the light hit him, his eyes adjusted, and he looked past me. He saw the two men standing like statues behind his mother. He saw the gleam of the badge on the deputy sheriff's chest and the grim, impassive face of Marcus Hale. My son stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing without sound, the colour draining from his face until he looked like a ghost. The deputy sheriff stepped forward, right up to the glass, and raised his voice so it carried through the fracture. He called out their full legal names, Ethan James Whitford and Sabrina K. Whitford. He informed them clearly that they were being video recorded in the commission of vandalism and attempted breaking and entering, and that they were currently suspects in an active investigation regarding elder abuse. Sabrina recovered faster than Ethan. She immediately switched tactics, her face twisting from aggression to feigned concern in a split second. She shouted that they were there to save me. She pointed a manicured finger at the house and screamed that I had lost my mind, that I had trapped myself inside, and that they were only trying to break the window to perform a wellness check. Marcus did not shout. He simply walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him so I remained safe inside. I stood by the window, watching the scene unfold like a play I had written myself. Marcus opened his briefcase and began pulling out documents one by one, handing them to the deputy to verify. He presented the temporary restraining order signed by the judge less than 2 hours ago. He produced the certified confirmation of the irrevocable trust. He held up the bank statements, highlighting the theft. Then, Marcus pulled out a small digital recorder. He held it up so they could see the red light, and he pressed play. Sabrina's voice, tinny but unmistakable, drifted across the frozen lawn. The recording was crystal clear. It was the conversation where she discussed arranging for me to fall down the stairs so they could get a doctor's note for incapacitation. She was laughing on the tape, calling it a necessary evil to speed up the probate process. I watched Sabrina's knees buckle. She grabbed Ethan's arm to steady herself, her face turning an ashen grey. She stammered, shouting that it was taken out of context, that it was just a dark joke. Marcus did not let up. He produced the power of attorney forms Ethan had tried to force me to sign. He held them up, shining his flashlight on the clauses that would have stripped me of all agency. He asked calmly if the fraudulent signature on the bank account was also a joke. The deputy sheriff shone his flashlight on the jagged rock lying in the snow at Ethan's feet. He asked my son if that was his idea of medical care. He told them he had enough probable cause to arrest them both right there on the front lawn for attempted assault and property damage. He warned them that if they made one more move toward the house, they would be leaving in the back of his cruiser. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. The wind howled through the trees, but no one moved. Ethan looked at the rock, then at the window, and finally at me. He looked small. He looked defeated. Marcus turned slowly to look at me through the glass. He spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. He asked me if I wanted to give them a chance to leave peacefully under the strict terms we had prepared, or if I wanted him to instruct the deputy to proceed with immediate criminal charges. The decision hung in the air, waiting for me to drop the blade. I looked at my son through the fractured glass. His hair was dishevelled. His eyes were wide with panic, and his hands were still trembling from the exertion of heaving that stone. For a fleeting second, the image of the infant who used to sleep soundly on my chest superimposed itself over the man standing before me. But then, the memory was violently shoved aside by the echo of his voice from the kitchen, cold and detached, saying that I had lived long enough. That sentence had killed the mother in me, leaving only the woman who refused to be a victim. I made my choice. I told Marcus to hold off on the handcuffs. I stepped out onto the porch and delivered my verdict. I told them I would not have them arrested tonight, but my mercy came with conditions. They had exactly 48 hours to vacate my property. They were never to return. They had to immediately initiate a payment plan to restore every cent they had stolen from my accounts. If they deviated from these terms by even an inch, I would hand the entire file of evidence over to the district attorney and push for maximum sentencing. Marcus stepped forward and read the stipulations from his clipboard in a monotone voice that sounded like a judge's gavel. He listed the assets they were forbidden from removing, which included the furniture they had bought with my money. He set a strict deadline for the return of the funds from the truck sale. He detailed the no-contact order that would go into permanent effect the moment they drove off the property. Sabrina exploded. The facade of the caring daughter-in-law disintegrated completely. She screamed profanities, pointing at the house and yelling that it belonged to her husband. She tried to throw Ethan under the bus, claiming he was the one who wanted the money. The deputy sheriff cut her off mid-scream, stepping into her personal space and reminding her that anything she said was being recorded and could be used to upgrade the charges to a felony elder abuse case. She shut her mouth instantly, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. Then Ethan crumbled. He dropped to his knees right there on the welcome mat. He started to sob, a jagged, ugly sound. He begged me. He blamed the debt. He blamed Sabrina's pressure. He even tried to blame his childhood, saying he just wanted to feel like he mattered to me. I listened to every word, but the warmth I used to feel for him was gone. I did not feel pity. I felt an exhaustion so deep it seemed to settle in my marrow. I looked down at him and spoke clearly. I told him that from the second he picked up that rock and aimed it at my window, he had made his choice. He had decided which side of the door he belonged on. I did not call him my sweet boy. I called him Ethan. I spoke to him as a stranger who had trespassed on my life. They signed the papers right there on the porch railing, under the watchful eye of the law. Sabrina snatched the pen, signed aggressively, and then grabbed Ethan by the collar, hauling him up. She spat out a threat that she would countersue, a hollow promise that frightened no one. They scrambled into their car, tires spinning on the gravel as they sped away into the dark morning. The rock lay abandoned on the walkway, a silent monument to an attack that had failed. As their taillights disappeared over the hill, the deputy packed up his camera. Marcus turned to me, his face softening for the first time that night. He asked if I was okay. I turned back to look at the spiderweb crack in my living room window. I told him that I was better than I had been in 4 months. My voice shook, and my eyes were burning. But I meant it. When they were gone, I was alone in the silence of the dawn. I walked out and picked up the rock. It was heavy and cold. I placed it on the windowsill, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what happens when you let your guard down. I found a roll of duct tape and patched the glass. Then, I went to the garage, dragged my husband's old armchair back into the living room, and sat down with a fresh pot of tea. There was no magical fast forward to a happy ending. There was just me, a quiet morning, and the realization that from this day forward, anyone who wanted to enter my life would have to walk through a door. I opened myself, not one they broke down with lies or stones. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the Grandma's Family Diary channel, hit the like button, and give it a hype to help this story reach even more people.